When she learns her husband of 30 years has terminal cancer, she decides to leave him. Soon after, she gets a phone call from her daughter that leaves her speechless. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing a pan with mechanical precision as sunlight streamed through the window. Outside, the garden David had tended for years blossomed with late summer blooms. She could hear his steady footsteps as he entered the room, but the usual warmth between them had long since cooled. Their conversations had dwindled to perfunctory exchanges about grocery lists and upcoming bills, leaving a silence that seemed heavier with each passing day. David cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "I saw Dr. Hendricks today," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge Margaret couldn't place. She turned, her hands still dripping soapy water. "What did he say?" There was a pause, long enough that Margaret felt her chest tighten. David wasn't one to mince words or stall for time. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, deliberately. "I have cancer. Terminal," he says. "A few months left. Maybe a year if I'm lucky." The pan slipped from Margaret's hands and clattered into the sink. She gripped the counter to steady herself as 1,000 thoughts flooded her mind. She stared at him, waiting for some sign that this was a mistake, a cruel joke, anything but the truth. David's face betrayed nothing but quiet resignation. His shoulders, already hunched from years of hard labor and time, seemed to sink further under the weight of his words. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself unable to summon anything beyond a faint, "Oh, yeah," David said, sitting down at the kitchen table. He folded his hands in front of him and stared at the wood grain as though it held answers. "The doc says there's nothing to be done. Just wait it out." Margaret sank into the chair across from him. Her mind scrambled for a response, a promise to fight this together, an offer of comfort, but the words felt foreign, insincere. She hadn't prepared for this. David glanced up at her, his eyes searching her face for something she wasn't sure she could give. "I don't want this to be harder than it needs to be. No hospitals, no drawn-out treatments. I just want to keep living as normally as I can." She nodded automatically, though the enormity of what he was saying barely registered. The hours that followed blurred into routine. Margaret cooked dinner, though neither of them ate much. David retreated to his study, the door shutting with a soft click that somehow felt final. She washed dishes, cleaned countertops, and folded laundry with a robotic efficiency, trying to outrun her thoughts. But as night fell and she lay in bed beside him, the weight of his diagnosis pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Over the past few years, their marriage had become something of a stalemate. They had once been passionate, inseparable even, but time had eroded their bond. Disagreements turned into grudges, and affection had been replaced by routine. Margaret had often fantasized about leaving, starting over somewhere new, finding a version of herself she'd lost along the way. Now, those thoughts twisted into something darker. She felt a pang of guilt as she glanced at David, who slept soundly beside her. He deserved her support, didn't he? She was his wife, his partner. But the idea of spending his final days together, of playing the dutiful caregiver while he withered away, filled her with an unnameable dread. The days passed, and Margaret found herself going through the motions with a numb detachment. She cooked his favorite meals, made his tea just the way he liked it, and listened as he spoke about the things he wanted to do before the end. But her mind was elsewhere, on the life she could have if she wasn't tied to this house, to this man who was already half gone in her eyes. One evening, as David sat reading in his armchair, Margaret wandered into the garage. She opened the trunk of her car and stared at it, imagining how easy it would be to pack a bag and drive away. She told herself it was just a fleeting thought, an idle fantasy, but the idea began to take root. She justified it in quiet moments when David wasn't looking. He didn't need her, not really. He was proud, independent. He'd probably prefer to face this alone rather than burden her with his suffering. And hadn't she sacrificed enough over the years? She had given him decades of her life, borne his children, managed their home. Wasn't she entitled to reclaim what was left of herself? Still, there were moments when guilt crept in, sharp and unforgiving. One afternoon, David found her in the garden, staring at a patch of lavender he'd planted for her years ago. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. She forced a smile. "Just thinking about how beautiful it looks." He nodded, his expression softening. "I'm glad. I planted it for you, back when I had more energy." His words struck a chord, and for a brief moment, she felt a pang of love for the man she had grown so distant from. But as quickly as the feeling came, it was swallowed by the mounting pressure of her conflicting emotions. The turning point came one night as they sat in the living room, the soft hum of the television filling the silence. David spoke without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the screen. "I know you've been unhappy." Margaret froze. "I've seen it in the way you look at me or don't. You don't have to pretend for my sake." "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David sighed and turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I don't blame you. I know I haven't been the easiest man to live with. But whatever you're feeling, just be honest with me." She opened her mouth to respond but found herself unable to lie. Instead, she simply nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. That night, as David slept, Margaret made her decision. The suitcase she had tucked away in the back of the closet was pulled out, and the beginnings of a plan took shape. She would leave. She told herself it was for the best, for both of them. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was running away from the fear, the pain, and the responsibility of watching him slip away. As she zipped the suitcase closed and slid it back into the closet, her heart ached with the knowledge that this choice would change everything. The days after Margaret made her decision passed in a strange, almost surreal haze. She moved through her routines with the precision of someone on autopilot, avoiding lingering in any one room for too long. Every chore felt like a countdown, a task she could cross off the mental list before her departure. David, oblivious or perhaps deliberately so, continued his quiet days reading, tending to his garden, or watching television in the evenings. His presence filled the house like a shadow she couldn't shake. Margaret began to pack her things late at night when she was certain David was asleep. She told herself it was practical, not cowardly, to avoid a confrontation. She started with small items, clothes she no longer wore, jewelry she rarely touched, and placed them in a suitcase hidden in the back of the closet. The ritual was oddly calming, a way to feel in control of the swirling chaos inside her. She rehearsed her justification countless times. She told herself that staying would do neither of them any good. What help could she truly offer him? He was a proud man, someone who would likely resent her attempts at caretaking. And hadn't their marriage been over in all but name for years? She clung to these thoughts like a lifeline, even as guilt gnawed at her edges. The morning of her planned departure arrived with a strange clarity. Margaret woke early, sunlight streaming through the curtains, and lay in bed for a moment listening to David's steady breathing. She turned her head to look at him, at the lines etched into his face from years of work and worry. She thought of the man she had married 3 decades ago, the way he had looked at her then, and felt a brief flicker of something, nostalgia, regret, perhaps both. But it wasn't enough to make her stay. By mid-morning, she had packed the last of her things. Her suitcase stood near the front door, and her car keys rested on the kitchen counter. She walked through the house one last time, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. The photographs on the walls seemed to watch her as she passed. Pictures of their wedding day, their children as toddlers, family vacations that now felt like artifacts from another life. She avoided looking too closely. David was in the garden, kneeling by the rose bushes he had planted years ago. His hands moved slowly but with precision, pruning dead stems and pulling weeds. Margaret hesitated by the window, watching him. For a moment, she considered walking outside to say goodbye, to explain herself, but the thought of his reaction filled her with dread. Instead, she picked up her suitcase and stepped out into the warm, late-morning air. As she approached the car, her chest tightened. She fumbled with the keys, the metal jangling in her hand, and opened the trunk. She had barely placed the suitcase inside when she heard the creak of the garden gate. She turned to see David standing there, a pair of pruning shears in one hand, his other hand resting lightly on the gate. He looked at her, his face unreadable. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his tone almost casual. Margaret froze, a rush of excuses flooding her mind, none of them coherent. I need to." She stopped, the weight of his gaze pinning her in place. David nodded slowly, setting the pruning shears down on the ground beside him. He walked toward her with a calmness that unsettled her, stopping a few feet away. For a moment, they stood in silence, the space between them filled with unspoken words. "You don't have to explain," he said finally, his voice soft. "I figured this might happen." His words hit her like a blow. She stared at him, searching for anger or bitterness in his expression, but found only a quiet sadness. It was worse than if he had shouted, worse than if he had accused her of betrayal. His resignation felt like a confirmation of everything she had feared, that she had already failed him long before this moment. I can't," Margaret stammered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to do this, David. I don't know how to watch you go through it." David nodded again, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I know, and I won't try to stop you. If this is what you need to do, then do it." His words were calm, but there was a finality to them that made Margaret's stomach twist. She wanted to say something, to explain herself in a way that would make him understand, but every justification felt hollow. Instead, she stepped back, her hand trembling as she gripped the car door. David stepped aside, giving her a clear path. As she climbed into the driver's seat, she glanced at him through the windshield. He stood there, his hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. She wondered if he would go back to his roses after she left, or if he would sit in the quiet house and think about her absence. The thought made her chest ache, but she pushed it aside. As the car pulled out of the driveway, Margaret glanced in the rearview mirror. David was still standing there, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, refusing to look back again. The drive was silent, the hum of the engine the only sound. Margaret felt a strange mixture of relief and regret, her emotions swirling together in a way that made it hard to breathe. She told herself she had done the right thing for herself, for David. She couldn't be the person he needed, and staying would only make things worse. But the hollow feeling in her chest suggested otherwise. She drove for hours, stopping only once at a gas station to stretch her legs. As she stood by the car, sipping a lukewarm coffee, she thought of David in the garden, his hands carefully tending the roses. She wondered if he was still out there or if he had gone inside, locking the door behind him. When she arrived at the small apartment she had rented in a neighboring town, the sun was beginning to set. The space was bare and unfamiliar, the walls painted a sterile white. Margaret set her suitcase down in the corner and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. The silence was deafening. She thought of calling someone, her daughter perhaps, but the idea of explaining herself felt too daunting. Instead, she lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, and let the exhaustion wash over her. She told herself she would feel better in the morning, that this was just the beginning of something new. But as the hours ticked by and sleep refused to come, Margaret found herself wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Margaret awoke to the unfamiliar hum of traffic outside her window, a sharp contrast to the stillness of the life she'd left behind. The pale morning light filtered through the thin curtains of her new apartment, casting a muted glow on the bare walls. She sat up slowly, the reality of her decision settling over her like a heavy blanket. This was it, the new life she'd wanted, the freedom she'd craved. But instead of relief, she felt a gnawing hollowness. She spent her first day unpacking, though there wasn't much to organize. Most of her belongings were still in the suitcase she had hastily packed, and she had only brought the essentials, clothes, toiletries, a few books she never got around to reading. As she placed her toothbrush in the empty holder by the sink, her thoughts drifted to David. She imagined him standing in their kitchen, making his morning tea the way he always did, the sound of the kettle's whistle filling the air. Would he miss her? Or had he already resigned himself to her absence? The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the muffled voices of neighbors through the thin walls. Margaret tried to fill the silence by turning on the small television that had come with the place, but the chatter of talk shows and commercials felt grating. She turned it off and wandered to the window, watching the city move below her. Cars honked, people bustled along the sidewalks, and somewhere in the distance, a street musician played a melancholic tune. The world carried on, indifferent to her upheaval. The next day, Margaret began her new part-time job at a local bookstore. It wasn't much, a few hours a week shelving books and ringing up customers, but it gave her something to do, a reason to leave the apartment. The shop was small and cozy, with the scent of aged paper and coffee lingering in the air. Her coworkers were polite but distant, and she didn't offer much about herself beyond her name and the fact that she was new in town. For the first week, she threw herself into the routine of work. She learned the layout of the store, memorized the sections, and found a certain comfort in the rhythmic task of organizing shelves. But no matter how busy she tried to keep herself, the thoughts of David crept in. She found herself pausing at the biography section, her eyes lingering on a book about rose gardening. It reminded her of him, of the hours he spent tending to the flowers in their yard. She quickly looked away, feeling a sharp pang of guilt. The nights were the hardest. Alone in her apartment, Margaret couldn't escape the memories of their life together. She thought about the early years, when they were still learning each other's quirks and dreams. She remembered the way he used to surprise her with small gestures, a cup of tea waiting for her on the nightstand, a handwritten note tucked into her purse. Those moments had grown scarce over the years, but they hadn't disappeared entirely. Just last Christmas, David had bought her a scarf in her favorite color, though she'd barely acknowledged it at the time. She wondered if he was thinking of her now, if he regretted letting her go so easily. The image of him standing by the garden gate, watching her drive away, replayed in her mind like a haunting refrain. His calm acceptance had unsettled her more than any anger could have. Did he feel relief? Sadness? Betrayal? She didn't know, and the not knowing gnawed at her. One evening, unable to sit with her thoughts any longer, Margaret went for a walk. The city was alive with lights and activity, but she felt like an outsider looking in. She wandered aimlessly, her feet carrying her through streets lined with restaurants, shops, and parks. She passed a young couple laughing together on a bench and felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Loss, perhaps, or envy. Their laughter reminded her of what she and David had once shared, long before life became routine and burdens replaced joy. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret began to settle into her new life, though it felt more like existing than truly living. She developed habits to distract herself: evening walks, afternoons spent reading in the small cafe near her apartment, and Sunday visits to the farmer's market. But no matter how hard she tried to keep herself occupied, the memories of David lingered, persistent and unyielding. One rainy afternoon, as she stood at the register ringing up a customer, an older man handed her a book titled Coping with Grief. The sight of it made her stomach turn. She forced a polite smile as she scanned the barcode, her hands trembling slightly. After he left, she sat behind the counter, staring at the cover of the book. Was she grieving? She hadn't thought of it that way before. She wasn't mourning David's death. He was still alive. But in a way, she felt as though she had lost him. Or maybe it was herself she had lost. That evening, she sat on the edge of her bed, holding her phone in her hands. She had avoided calling anyone from her old life, not wanting to explain herself or confront their judgment. But tonight, the silence felt unbearable. She scrolled through her contacts until she landed on David's name. Her thumb hovered over the call button, her heart pounding. What would she even say? Would he answer? Did he want to hear from her? In the end, she set the phone down and curled up under the blanket, tears slipping silently down her face. She thought of David alone in their house, sitting in his study or tending to the garden, and wondered if he missed her at all. She told herself that she had made the right choice, that she couldn't have been the support he needed, but the ache in her chest told a different story. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the bookstore to find a delivery of new inventory waiting to be shelved. As she unpacked the boxes, she came across a book titled The Art of Letting Go. She laughed bitterly under her breath, the irony not lost on her. She flipped through its pages idly, stopping on a passage about forgiveness. The words blurred as she thought of David, of the forgiveness she might never deserve. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to consider the possibility that she had been wrong. Wrong to leave, wrong to think she couldn't handle the pain of staying. But what could she do now? She had left, and David had let her go. The life they had shared was gone, and she wasn't sure if she could ever reclaim it. Margaret placed the book back on the shelf and returned to her task, her hands moving automatically. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. She glanced out the window, her thoughts still heavy, and wondered what David was doing at that very moment. Margaret was folding a pile of laundry in her small apartment, the rhythmic motion of her hands offering a temporary escape from her thoughts. The radio played softly in the background, a familiar tune from her younger days that tugged at her memories. She hummed along absent-mindedly until the sharp ring of her phone startled her. Tossing the shirt she was holding onto the bed, she reached for the phone, her heart sinking slightly as she saw her daughter's name flash on the screen. "Hello," Margaret answered, trying to sound cheerful, though her voice carried a hint of apprehension. "Mom," her daughter Sarah began, her voice trembling with a mix of urgency and excitement. "I have news about Dad." Margaret froze, her hand tightening around the phone. She had been bracing herself for this moment since the day she left, fearing the worst, yet hoping that somehow she'd never hear it. "What is it?" she managed, her throat dry. It's not what we thought," Sarah said, her words coming quickly now. "The doctors made a mistake. Dad doesn't have cancer. The scans, they were wrong. He's going to be okay." The words hung in the air, their weight crashing over Margaret like a wave. For a moment, she couldn't respond, couldn't process what she'd just heard. "What do you mean?" she whispered, barely able to form the question. "There was some kind of mix-up with the lab results," Sarah explained, her voice shaking. "They ran more tests after you left and everything came back clear. He's fine, Mom. He's going to live." Margaret sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly weak. Relief flooded her chest, but it was quickly followed by something darker. Regret, guilt, and a creeping sense of panic. She had left him. She had walked away, believing she couldn't bear to stay, and now he was going to be fine. That's incredible," she finally said, her voice trembling. "I'm so glad." "Yeah, it is," Sarah replied, her tone softening. "But, Mom, he didn't want me to call you. He said you made your choice." The words pierced Margaret like a dagger. She felt her breath catch, her vision blurring as tears welled in her eyes. "He said that. He's angry, Mom. I mean, I don't blame him, but..." Sarah trailed off, as if unsure how to navigate the delicate terrain of her parents' fractured relationship. "I just thought you should know. I thought you'd want to hear it." Margaret nodded, though Sarah couldn't see her. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I needed to know." After they hung up, Margaret sat in silence, the phone still clutched in her hand. The laundry lay forgotten beside her, the neatly folded shirts and towels suddenly insignificant. Her mind raced, replaying every moment of her departure, every justification she had made for leaving. The hollow ache she had felt since that day swelled into something unbearable. He was alive. He was going to live, and she had left him in his moment of greatest need. Margaret stood abruptly, pacing the small apartment as her thoughts spiraled. She had to go back. She had to make things right. The life she had fled from, the man she had abandoned, they weren't lost after all. There was still a chance, wasn't there? A chance to start over, to rebuild what had been broken. David was still her husband, the man she had shared 30 years with. That had to count for something. The next morning, Margaret packed a small bag and called in sick to work. She couldn't bring herself to tell her boss the real reason. She could barely articulate it to herself. All she knew was that she had to see David, to explain herself, to somehow find a way back into his life. The drive felt both agonizingly slow and unnervingly fast. Every mile brought her closer to the home she had left behind. Yet with each passing moment, her anxiety grew. What if he refused to see her? What if he had already moved on, decided that he didn't need her anymore? The thought made her grip the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white with tension. When she pulled into the driveway, the sight of the house hit her like a punch to the gut. It looked exactly as she had left it, familiar yet foreign. The garden was still meticulously maintained, the roses in full bloom. She could almost picture David there, kneeling by the flower beds with his gardening tools in hand. But now, the house felt like someone else's, a place she no longer had a right to call home. She sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say on the drive, but now the words felt hollow, inadequate. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage she had, she stepped out of the car and walked up to the door. Her hand trembled as she knocked. For a long moment, there was no response, and she wondered if he might not be home. But then she heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and the door opened. David stood there, his expression unreadable. He looked healthier than she had expected, his complexion no longer ashen, his posture more upright. But his eyes, once warm and kind, now held a guarded edge. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady but devoid of the affection she had once taken for granted. "What are you doing here?" She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her carefully crafted explanation, her pleas for forgiveness, all of it felt woefully inadequate in the face of his quiet composure. "David, I heard the news," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the diagnosis." He nodded, his expression remaining neutral. "Sarah told you?" "She did," Margaret admitted. "I'm so relieved, David. I'm so happy you're okay." "Thank you," he said simply, his tone giving nothing away. "I came back because—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I made a mistake. Leaving was a mistake. I thought I couldn't handle it, but I was wrong. I want to make things right." David's gaze didn't waver, but his silence stretched long enough that Margaret's chest tightened. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, deliberate. "I'm glad you're relieved," he said. "But you left, Margaret. You made your choice, and I've had a lot of time to think about that." His words landed like a blow, and Margaret felt her legs weaken. "David, please," she began, tears streaming down her face. "I know I hurt you. I know I was wrong, but we've been through so much together. Doesn't that mean anything?" "It does," he said, his voice softening just slightly. "But so does the fact that you weren't here when I needed you most." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, to plead, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't anger or bitterness. It was a quiet resolve, a determination to protect himself from further hurt. She realized, in that moment, that her return might not be enough. David stepped back, his hand resting on the edge of the door. "I think it's best if we leave things as they are," he said. "Take care, Margaret." And with that, he closed the door. Margaret stood motionless on the doorstep after David closed the door, the quiet click of the latch echoing louder than it should have. She stared at the polished wood, her chest tightening as she imagined him walking away, back into the house they'd once shared. She raised her hand to knock again, hesitated, and then let it drop. What more could she say that would change his mind? What right did she even have to demand it? But the alternative, to walk away again, felt unbearable. She had come all this way, fueled by a desperate hope that she could undo the damage, fix what had been broken. If she left now, it would mean accepting that their 30 years together were truly over. Margaret drew a shaky breath and knocked once more, louder this time. The wait felt interminable, and she half expected him not to answer. But then she heard the sound of his footsteps approaching, deliberate and unhurried, and the door opened again. David stood there, his face unreadable. His posture was rigid, his arms crossed loosely in front of him, as though bracing himself for an argument. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence between them thick with everything they hadn't said. "Margaret," he said evenly, his voice calm but distant. "I thought I made myself clear." "You did," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But please, David, I need to talk to you. Just give me a few minutes. That's all I'm asking." David sighed, his shoulders rising and falling with a weariness that Margaret recognized all too well. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter, but his expression remained impassive. She stepped inside, the familiar scent of the house wrapping around her like a ghost. It was so unchanged, yet everything about it felt foreign now. Her absence had turned it into a stranger's home. David led her to the living room, where the faint hum of the television played in the background. He picked up the remote, muted the sound, and sat down in his usual armchair. Margaret perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You wanted to talk," David said finally, breaking the silence. His tone was polite but distant, as though he were addressing a neighbor rather than the woman he'd spent most of his life with. Margaret swallowed hard, her rehearsed words scattering like leaves in the wind. "David, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I hurt you, and I can't tell you how sorry I am for leaving when you needed me most." David's expression didn't change. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady but guarded. "You're right. You don't deserve my forgiveness." His words hit her like a slap, and she flinched, tears springing to her eyes. But she forced herself to keep going. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I didn't know how to handle it. I thought I couldn't. I thought it would destroy me to watch you suffer." "And what about me?" David asked, his voice still calm but with a sharp edge. "Do you think it was easy for me, knowing I was dying? Knowing I had to face it alone because my wife, the person I trusted most, decided she couldn't be bothered." Margaret's tears spilled over, and she wiped at them furiously. "It wasn't about being bothered, David. I was overwhelmed. I didn't know how to be what you needed." David shook his head slowly, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You didn't even try, Margaret. You made that decision for both of us. You didn't give me a chance to tell you what I needed. You just left." His words cut through her defenses, and she felt the full weight of her actions pressing down on her. He was right, she hadn't tried. She had been so consumed by her own fear and resentment that she hadn't stopped to consider what he might have wanted or needed. I thought you'd be better off without me," she said weakly, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. David let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's a convenient excuse, isn't it? Makes it easier to leave when you convince yourself you're doing it for someone else's benefit." Margaret bowed her head, unable to meet his gaze. "I regret it every day," she said softly. "I've been miserable without you, David. I thought about calling so many times, but I didn't know if you'd even want to hear from me. And now you're here," David said, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. "Why? Because you found out I'm not dying? Because suddenly I'm not a burden anymore?" The accusation stung, but Margaret couldn't deny the kernel of truth in it. She had left because she couldn't handle the thought of his illness, and she had come back because she thought his recovery would make it easier to fix what had been broken. But it wasn't that simple, and she knew it. "I came back because I love you," she said, her voice trembling. "Because I realized that I made the biggest mistake of my life when I walked away. I thought I couldn't handle the pain, but losing you was worse." David studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "I loved you too, Margaret. I still do, in a way. But love isn't enough to erase what happened. You left me when I needed you most. That's not something I can just forget." Margaret's chest tightened, and she felt the tears spilling over again. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're just going to shut me out? After everything we've been through?" David sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. For the first time, he looked tired, the weight of their shared history pressing down on him. "I don't know what you want from me, Margaret. Forgiveness? Reconciliation? I can't give you those things right now. Maybe not ever. You made your choice and I had to make mine." His words hung in the air, final and unyielding. Margaret wanted to argue, to plead, but she could see the resolve in his eyes. He wasn't angry, he was hurt, deeply hurt in a way that no apology could fix. David stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "You should go," he said quietly. "I need time to think, and so do you." Margaret rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to reach for him, to touch his hand or his face, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. She nodded silently, unable to trust her voice, and walked toward the door. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her like a slap. She turned back once, hoping for some sign of warmth, some glimmer of hope in David's expression. But he was already closing the door, leaving her alone once again. Margaret sat in her car outside Sarah's house, her hands gripping the steering wheel as if anchoring herself in place. It had been years since she'd visited. Holidays and birthdays had always been celebrated at the family home, and she hadn't seen a need to visit Sarah separately. But now everything felt different. She wasn't sure if she belonged here anymore, if her presence would be welcomed. The call with Sarah earlier that week had been brief and hesitant. Sarah's tone was polite but laced with something Margaret couldn't quite name. She'd suggested Margaret stop by if she wanted to talk. And though the words had seemed like an invitation, the lack of warmth had lingered in Margaret's mind. Finally, summoning her courage, Margaret stepped out of the car and approached the front door. She hesitated before knocking, rehearsing the words she might say. The sound of children's laughter filtered through the door, a reminder of the life Sarah had built, a life Margaret had drifted further from in recent years. The door opened before she could knock again. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice a mix of surprise and guardedness. She stepped aside, motioning Margaret in, but there was no embrace, no smile. Margaret stepped over the threshold, the familiar smell of fresh-baked cookies and lemon cleaner filling the air. The house was warm and inviting, but the atmosphere felt strained. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," Margaret said, her voice more uncertain than she'd intended. Sarah shook her head. "No, the kids are just playing upstairs. They won't even notice you're here." The words, though seemingly innocent, stung. Margaret followed Sarah into the living room, where a pile of folded laundry sat on the couch. Sarah gestured for her to sit, then took a seat in the armchair across from her, her posture stiff and formal. "How's Dad?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. Margaret hesitated, unsure how much Sarah already knew. "I went to see him," she admitted, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "We talked, or tried to. He wasn't ready to forgive me." Sarah nodded, her expression unreadable. "I can't say I blame him." Margaret flinched at the words, though she had expected them. "I know I hurt him. I know I hurt all of you, and I don't expect you to just forget what I did. But I'm trying to make things right." Sarah leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "Do you really think you can just walk back into our lives and fix everything? That's not how this works, Mom. You left. You abandoned Dad when he thought he was dying. Do you know how that felt? For him? For us?" Margaret swallowed hard, her throat tight with guilt. "I thought I was doing what was best," she said quietly. "I was scared. I didn't know how to handle it. Scared." Sarah's voice rose, anger breaking through her calm exterior. "Do you think we weren't scared? We thought we were going to lose him and you just disappeared. You didn't even try to be there for him." The words cut deep, and Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. "I know I was wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "I made a terrible mistake, and I'm trying to make up for it. But I need a chance to do that." Sarah leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "It's not just about Dad, Mom. It's about us too. You didn't just hurt him, you hurt me and Daniel. You broke something in this family, and I don't know if it can be fixed." Margaret's heart sank at the mention of her son. She hadn't spoken to Daniel since leaving, and the thought of reaching out to him filled her with dread. He had always been closer to David, sharing his father's quiet strength and steady nature. If Sarah's anger was this palpable, she could only imagine what Daniel might say, or not say, as the case might be. "I know I can't undo what I've done," Margaret said softly, "but I want to try. I want to be there for you and your brother, for your kids. I don't want to lose this family." Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained wary. "It's not that simple, Mom. Trust takes time to rebuild. And right now, I don't know if I can trust you." The words hung heavy in the air, and Margaret felt their weight pressing down on her. She had always thought of herself as a good mother, even when her marriage had started to falter. But now, faced with the reality of what her actions had cost, she realized just how fragile those bonds had become. "I don't know how to fix this," Margaret admitted, tears spilling over. "But I'll do whatever it takes. Please, Sarah, just give me a chance." Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know, Mom. I need time. We all do. This isn't something that can be fixed overnight." Margaret nodded, though her heart ached at the distance between them. "I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll give you space, but I hope you'll let me prove myself." They sat in silence for a moment before the sound of footsteps thundered down the stairs. Sarah's children burst into the room, their laughter filling the space as they chased each other around the couch. Margaret watched them, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. She had missed so much already: birthdays, milestones, moments she could never get back. As the children darted past her, one of them paused, staring at her curiously. "Who's that, Mommy?" the boy asked, pointing at Margaret. Sarah hesitated, glancing at her mother before replying. "That's Grandma," she said simply. The boy tilted his head, then shrugged and ran off to join his sister. Margaret's chest tightened at the word, Grandma. It felt foreign now, like a title she hadn't earned. "I should go," Margaret said, standing abruptly. "I didn't mean to take up so much of your time." Sarah didn't stop her, but she followed her to the door. As Margaret stepped outside, she turned back, searching her daughter's face for any sign of hope. "Thank you for seeing me," Margaret said. "I know it wasn't easy." Sarah nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Take care, Mom." The door closed gently behind her, and Margaret stood on the porch for a moment, the cool air brushing against her face. She had hoped for more, a chance to start rebuilding the bridges she had burned. But she knew now that it wouldn't come easily. Trust wasn't something that could be reclaimed with words alone. It would take time, effort, and patience, things she wasn't sure she deserved. As she walked back to her car, Margaret glanced over her shoulder at the house. The laughter of her grandchildren echoed faintly through the windows, a reminder of the life she had stepped away from. She drove away feeling the full weight of her actions, the shattered trust not just between her and David, but between her and the family they had built together. The idea of writing the letter came to Margaret late one night as she lay in her apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling. Sleep had evaded her for weeks, replaced by an endless loop of regret and unspoken words. The conversation with Sarah had shaken her, making her realize just how deeply her actions had fractured her family. She couldn't rewrite the past, but perhaps she could finally put her feelings into words, even if they fell on deaf ears. The next morning, Margaret sat at her small dining table, a blank sheet of paper in front of her. She held the pen loosely, her mind whirring as she tried to organize her thoughts. The silence of the room pressed in on her, and for a moment, she considered abandoning the idea altogether. But then she thought of David, of the life they had built together, and the pain she had caused him by walking away. The least she could do was try to explain. Her hand trembled as she began to write. "Dear David, I don't know if you'll ever read this letter, but I need to write it. There are so many things I should have said to you, so many moments where I let my fear and selfishness speak louder than my love for you. I can't undo what I've done, but I hope these words can at least help you understand why I made the choices I did. When I heard about your diagnosis, I was terrified, not just for you but for myself. The thought of losing you, of watching you slip away, felt unbearable. I convinced myself that I wasn't strong enough to face it, that you would be better off without me. I told myself I was sparing you from my weakness, but the truth is, I was running away. I was running from the pain, from the responsibility, from the reality of what it meant to truly love someone through the hardest moments. In the weeks after I left, I told myself it was the right decision, that you were better off without me. But every day, the silence grew louder, and the distance between us felt like a weight I couldn't escape. I thought I would find freedom, but instead, I found regret. I thought I was protecting myself, but instead, I lost the one thing that mattered most. You. When Sarah called to tell me the diagnosis was wrong, my first emotion was relief. Relief that you were going to live, that you would have more time. But that relief was quickly swallowed by guilt. Guilt that I had abandoned you when you needed me most. Guilt that I had let my fear dictate my actions, and in doing so, betrayed the love we had shared for so many years. David, I want you to know that my decision to leave was never about a lack of love for you. If anything, it was the opposite. I loved you so much that I couldn't bear the thought of watching you suffer. But I see now that love isn't about avoiding pain. It's about being there, even when it hurts. And I failed you in that. I'm not writing this letter to ask for forgiveness. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't think I deserve it. I'm writing this because you deserve to hear the truth, to know that I am deeply, profoundly sorry for the hurt I caused. If I could go back and do it differently, I would. But since I can't, all I can do is offer you my honesty now. I also want to say that I still love you. That love hasn't faded, even in the face of everything. And while I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, I hope that, in time, we can find a way to repair the damage I've done. Not just for us, but for our family. I want to be there for Sarah and Daniel, for our grandchildren, in whatever way they'll let me. I want to do better to be better, not because I think it will fix everything, but because it's the least I can do. No matter what happens, I wish you nothing but happiness and peace. You deserve that, David. You always have. With all my heart, Margaret. Margaret stared at the letter for a long time after she finished writing. The words on the page felt like an extension of herself, raw and vulnerable. She read it over several times, her eyes blurring with tears, but she didn't change a single word. It was imperfect, just like her, but it was honest. And that was all she could offer now. The next day, Margaret folded the letter carefully, slipping it into an envelope. She debated whether to deliver it herself or mail it, but in the end, she decided that handing it to David in person would be too much. She couldn't bear to see the look in his eyes again, the quiet disappointment that spoke louder than any words ever could. She addressed the envelope, then walked to the nearest post office. As she dropped it into the mailbox, a strange sense of calm washed over her. For the first time in months, she felt as though she had done something right, however small. The letter wouldn't erase the past, but it was a step forward, a way to take responsibility for her choices. The following days passed slowly, each one filled with a mixture of hope and dread. She didn't know if David would respond, or if he would even read the letter. But she told herself that wasn't the point. The point was that she had tried, that she had put her heart into words and sent them out into the world, however they might be received. One afternoon, as she sat in her apartment reading, her phone buzzed with a notification. Her heart leapt when she saw Sarah's name on the screen. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said, her voice softer than it had been during their last conversation. "Hi, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her voice trembling slightly. "How are you?" "I'm okay," Sarah said. There was a pause, and Margaret's chest tightened, bracing for whatever came next. "Dad got your letter." Margaret's breath caught. "And?" she asked, barely able to get the word out. "He read it," Sarah said. I think it meant something to him. He didn't say much, but I could tell it affected him." Margaret closed her eyes, relief flooding through her. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I'm not saying everything's fixed," Sarah added quickly, "but maybe it's a start." Margaret nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. "That's all I wanted," she said. "A start." After they hung up, Margaret sat in silence for a long time, the weight on her chest feeling just a little lighter. It wasn't redemption, not yet. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. Margaret hadn't expected to hear from David again, at least not directly. After Sarah's call, she had clung to the sliver of hope that the letter might lead to something, a conversation, a chance to sit across from him and explain herself fully. But days passed without word, and she told herself she would have to accept that this might be the end of their story. Then, late one evening, her phone rang. She saw his name on the screen, the simple David, startling in its clarity, as though no time had passed. Her heart raced as she answered, her voice shaky with anticipation. "Hello, Margaret." His voice was steady, familiar, but carried a calm finality she couldn't place. "David," she breathed, unsure what else to say. The silence that followed stretched long enough for her to feel the weight of everything unspoken between them. "I got your letter," he said finally. "I've read it a few times." Her chest tightened. "And?" she asked, her voice tentative. "I appreciate it," he said. "It was honest, and I think it's something we both needed. But I need you to understand something." Margaret held her breath, bracing herself. "I'm not angry anymore," David continued. "I was, for a long time, but reading your letter, it made me realize I've spent too much time holding on to that anger, and I don't want to carry it with me any longer. I forgive you, Margaret." The relief hit her like a wave, tears spilling over as she clutched the phone. "David, thank you," she whispered. "You don't know how much that means to me." "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," he said gently. "And it doesn't mean we can go back to what we were." Margaret's breath caught, her relief quickly replaced by a deep ache. "I understand," she said, though the words felt hollow. "I've thought a lot about this," David said. "About us, about everything we've been through. I loved you, Margaret. I still do, in some ways. We built a life together, beautiful, messy, imperfect, and I'll always cherish that. But I can't let you back into my life the way you want." His words were kind, but they cut deeper than she had expected. She had known this was a possibility, had prepared herself for it, but hearing it from him was something else entirely. "David," she began, her voice trembling. "Isn't there any chance we could?" He interrupted her softly. "No, Margaret. I found a kind of peace, and I need to protect that. Letting you back in would mean reopening wounds that are finally starting to heal. I can't do that to myself." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Margaret nodded, though he couldn't see her, her hand gripping the phone as though it could anchor her to the moment. "I understand," she said again, this time with more resolve. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of 30 years hung between them, memories of laughter and arguments, shared dreams and shattered trust. "I wish you well," David said at last. "I really do. I hope you find what you're looking for." "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I wish the same for you." When the call ended, Margaret sat in silence, the phone still clutched in her hand. She replayed his words in her mind, trying to absorb their meaning. He had forgiven her, but the life they had shared was truly over. She would have to accept that. The next morning, she packed a small bag and left her apartment. The city that had once seemed like a place of escape now felt suffocating, filled with reminders of her choices and their consequences. She didn't have a clear destination in mind, but she knew she needed to leave, to start over somewhere new. As she drove through the countryside, the open road stretching endlessly ahead, Margaret allowed herself to reflect on the past few months. She had made mistakes, terrible, life-altering mistakes, but she had also learned more about herself than she ever thought possible. She had faced her fears, admitted her faults, and begun the slow, painful process of rebuilding. The journey wasn't over, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. Trust wasn't something that could be repaired overnight, not with her children, not with herself. But she was determined to try, to take the lessons she had learned and use them to become a better version of herself. She stopped at a small diner off the highway, ordering a cup of coffee and sitting by the window. The world outside was quiet, the early morning light casting long shadows across the parking lot. For the first time in months, Margaret felt a small flicker of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had the strength to face it. Alone, perhaps, but stronger and wiser than she had been before. Meanwhile, David sat in his garden, the sun warming his face as he tended to the roses. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter now, the anger and resentment replaced by a quiet acceptance. He thought of Margaret and the life they had shared, and while there was still sadness, there was also gratitude. He had chosen to move forward, to embrace the time he had left and the possibilities it held. The garden, once a symbol of their shared love, now felt like a place of renewal, a reminder that even after loss, life could bloom again. As Margaret drove away from the diner, the road ahead felt like a blank canvas, waiting to be filled. She didn't look back, not because she had forgotten, but because she was ready to move forward. One step at a time, Margaret stood on the pier, the salty breeze tugging at her hair. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, its surface shimmering in the golden light of the setting sun. She had arrived in this quiet seaside town 2 weeks ago, drawn by its solitude and the promise of a fresh start. The little bed and breakfast where she stayed overlooked the water, and every morning she would sit by the window, watching the waves roll in and out, their rhythm soothing her restless thoughts. She thought often of David, of their conversation and his finality. There were moments when the pain of his words crept back into her chest, sharp and unforgiving. But more often now, she found herself focusing on the gratitude she felt, for his honesty, for the forgiveness he had offered, for the life they had shared, however imperfect it had been. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph she had taken from the house before she left, one of the few items she had allowed herself to keep. It was a picture of their family during a summer picnic years ago, the 4 of them smiling in the golden light of a day that had seemed endless. She ran her fingers over the edges of the photo, the memory both sweet and bittersweet. She thought about Sarah and Daniel, her children, and the slow process of rebuilding trust with them. Sarah had called again a few days after David's, her tone softer than before. They had talked about the grandchildren, about small, ordinary things. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Margaret knew it would take time, perhaps years, to mend those relationships. But she was no longer afraid of the work it required. She had spent so long running from the consequences of her choices, from the pain of her mistakes. But now she understood that growth and healing could only come by facing them head-on. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, she placed the photograph back in her pocket and leaned against the railing, watching the water. The quiet solitude of this place had given her space to reflect, to think about the person she wanted to become. She had started journaling each night, filling pages with thoughts, regrets, and small victories. It was a habit she had never tried before, but it grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. For David, the garden became a sanctuary in the months that followed. He spent hours tending to the flowers, his hands working the soil as his mind wandered to memories of the past and dreams for the future. He took up a part-time job at the community center, teaching woodworking to young people who reminded him of his own children at that age. The laughter and energy of the students filled a void he hadn't realized existed. One afternoon, Sarah and the grandchildren visited him unexpectedly. As they walked through the garden, the children marveled at the roses, their small hands reaching out to touch the delicate petals. David watched them with a quiet smile, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but it was a good life. Margaret decided to stay in the seaside town at least for a while. She found a job at the local library, organizing shelves and chatting with the regulars who came in to borrow books. The work was simple but fulfilling, and she began to feel a sense of belonging she hadn't expected. She even started a small book club, inviting members of the community to gather and share stories. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One evening, as she walked along the beach, her thoughts turned to David again. She imagined him in the garden, his hands dirty with soil, a satisfied smile on his face. She hoped he was happy, that he had found peace in the life he had chosen. And for the first time, she realized that she wasn't just wishing it for him, she was beginning to feel it for herself as well. The waves lapped gently at the shore, and Margaret closed her eyes, breathing in the salt-tinged air. She felt a quiet resolve settle over her, a sense that she was exactly where she needed to be. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of it. Somewhere, David stood in his garden as the sun set, the soft hum of crickets filling the air. He looked at the roses, vibrant and alive, and thought of Margaret. He didn't regret their time together, nor did he resent its end. Instead, he felt gratitude for the love they had shared and the freedom they now both had to find their own paths. Life, like the waves, moved forward, and for both of them, that was enough. Margaret and David's tale is a reflection of the complexities of love, forgiveness, and the courage it takes to grow, even in the face of regret. Life doesn't always give us second chances in the way we hope, but it often gives us opportunities to make peace with the past and create a future worth living. If the story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Have you ever had to rebuild a relationship or start fresh after a painful chapter? Let's start a conversation below. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Thank you for watching,